Now, you open your book with one of the most important cases in your career, and that's the Night Stalker case. Take me through that from the beginning, how that unfolded in San Francisco.
The Night Stalker case was absolutely fascinating, only because this was a sick, pathetic, psychopath killer who killed for the sheer joy of being a Satan worshiper and offering up people to the devil. So anything horrible, heinous he could think of would be justified by his worshiping the devil.
This was truly a nightmarish scenario, something out of a horror film.
Absolutely out of a horror movie. The man was criminally insane and bent on hurting and killing. We had heard about what was going on in the Los Angeles area. They called him the walk-in killer, the intruder, all these different names of these murder cases that were happening in LA. And then one Saturday afternoon, my partner Carl Klotz and I got a call out to Eucalyptus Avenue off of Sloat Boulevard in San Francisco, where Mr. and Mrs. Peter Pan were shot. She survived for a while. He was dead in his bedroom. She had been sexually assaulted. Scratchings on the wall of a symbol, a satanic symbol, where he pleasured himself as he was etching this into the wall, semen on the carpet. Just a sick scene. He actually went into the refrigerator after killing the husband, raping the wife, ate their food, regurgitated on the floor of the kitchen, ransacked the house looking for stolen and things of value. So we had no clue what we had going. And then a very, very...
You didn't know this was the Night Stalker?
No way. No way. They have their cases, we have our case. We never linked it together. So a couple of days later, after we put out a teletype about our murder...
Which is, explain what a teletype is. You put some of the basic facts of what had happened that you think other law enforcement agencies might recognize through this network of, cops around the state of California and say, hey, we have a case where we had a pentagram scratched in the wall, or we have a case where we had a similar caliber bullet used.
That's exactly what happened with ballistics. A young sergeant by the name of John Perkins, very, very diligent detective from Glendale Police Department, calls the office, gets my partner Carl Klotz, and he says, we're working similar cases down here in LA. And as they're talking, John Perkins mentions a .22 caliber bullet with a pink primer, pretty rare. And when Carl heard that, he got very excited. That was the first break linking our case to the LA cases. After that, we made, I'd say, at least 3, maybe 4 trips to LA, gleaned as much information as we could, and eventually, thanks to a report made by Northern Station officers, ironically, one was my son, Dan Falzon, and his partner, Marty Kilgariff. There was a burglary out on in the marina of a doctor's house, and the doctor had inscribed in his wife's bracelet the serial number of his car license. And that bracelet showed up in Lompoc, California, and we were able eventually to link it back to a man named Armando Rodriguez. Armando Rodriguez...
He's out in El Sobrante, correct?
We first went to San Pablo and saw this woman who had the bracelet by the name of Donna Myers. And Donna Myers said she got it from her boyfriend, Armando Rodriguez. We eventually talk to Armando Rodriguez, and we eventually get the name Richard Ramirez. Not only broke our case, but it broke all the LA cases. And eventually we served a search warrant on Armando's house, came up with so much stolen property, including property taken from Mr. and Mrs. Peter Pan.
So tell me a little bit about how you got that name out of him. You had heard the name Rick. There was this name from a possible dentist appointment note down in Southern California, but you had heard from Donna that Armando's friend had a friend named Rick that had this jewelry. Is that correct?
Yes, she had told us that Armando and Rick were worshiping the devil, and that they were very close. They did everything together. So when we went to see Armando, he lived inside iron gates, no way to get in. House was set up on a hill. So we went across the street to the El Sobrante Fire Department. It was directly across the street from the house. And we asked if we could use their phone. I called Armando. I told him who I was. And I made it sound like I had urgent information for him, and I couldn't give it to him over the phone. I had to talk to him in person. I said, please come down and meet me at the gate. He was reluctant. I said, well, I think this is information you should know. So he did. He came down to the gate, but in the process, he had 2 Doberman pinchers, dogs on leashes that were growling. He's on the other side of the gate, and I'm looking at him. I'm looking at the dogs. I said, I'm not going to talk to you with 2 dogs growling at me. Step out from behind the gate so we can have a conversation. And I turned my back, and I started to walk towards the San Pablo police detective's car. And when I turn around, there's Armando standing between me and my partner, Carl Klotz. So I looked at him, I said, you know, Armando, we have information, your best friend, Rick. We had learned the name Rick from the LAPD. Solo motorcycle cop had made a stop. And the individual they were talking to had given a dentist card with the name Rick on it. And then he bolted and got away from the solo motorcycle cop. But the LA detectives, Leroy Orozco and Paul Tippin, felt in their hearts he was the Night Stalker. So we had that first name, Rick. I said, I need to know Rick's last name. And he looked at me and he began swearing, F you, F you. Rick is not the Night Stalker. I know for a fact. When he was in LA, murders were happening in San Francisco. When he was in San Francisco, murders were happening in LA. I said, look, Armando, it's not your job. It's my job. Let me look into it. If your friend Rick is innocent, we'll clear him. F you, man. I'm not telling you anything. I pat him down, no weapons. My partner instinctively opens the back door. I place Armando Rodriguez in the back seat. My partner goes around, gets in the seat next to him. The San Pablo detective that was chauffeuring us around gets in the driver's seat. I get into the passenger seat. As I'm getting in, I look across the street. There's 6, 7 El Sobrante uniformed firemen standing out by the curb watching every move we make. So the car is sitting still right in front of Armando's home. And I lean over the back seat and I look at him. I said, please, I'm begging you. I don't want nobody to die this weekend. I need your help. All we need is a last name. Give me the last name of Rick. And again, he starts verbally abusing me. And F you, you put your hands on me, you mother this, you mother that. I said, that's not necessary. And I didn't realize, as I was talking to him, I had formed a fist on the front seat as I'm talking to him, he looks at my fist and his hands came up. He goes, "Oh, you want to fight me?" He calls me MF again. And one thing I learned a long time ago, somebody's fist comes up, that's a challenge to fight. And I'm not going to take the first punch in the face. I threw the first punch. I hit him right in the eye. A little cut, about half an inch. And he falls over onto my partner, Carl. Carl pushes him back upright. Armando dabs his cheek. And he goes, "Look what you did to me, you mother," again. He said, "Is that as hard as you hit, tough guy?" The fist come up again. I said, "No, I'm not a tough guy. But that's not as hard as I can hit. I'm going to show you how hard I can hit." And I leaned towards the window, and I started over the seat. I don't know if it was a bluff or not. I told him I was going to split him from the top of his head down to his behind. As I'm coming over the seat, he throws his arms up in an X, and he says, Richard Ramirez, man, Richard Ramirez, that's the name." I fell back in my seat, totally exhausted. That had been weeks we were working 17, 18, 19 hours a day, no sleep, flying back and forth to LA, knocking on doors. We finally had the name, and within hours, we had an arrest warrant, search warrant. LAPD, LASO asked us to fly down there and place our murder warrant, because our case was made, to hold the Night Stalker so that they could make their cases.
And eventually, within days of issuing your warrant, the public had seen the picture of Richard Ramirez in the local papers. He got off a bus from Arizona, and the second he walks into this East LA neighborhood, people recognize him.
Yeah, his picture was all over every newspaper in the state. And that was another thing that came up. We did a 3-way conference call, the LA sheriffs, LAPD, San Francisco police. I'm standing there with Carl Klotz, at that time our chief, Con Murphy, on this 3-way call. And Sheriff Block from the Sheriff's Department in LA says, "We want your men to stand down until we can make our cases." And the chief looked at me. I said, "No, we're not going to stand down." I said, "Think about it, Chief. We stand down. Everybody in the Hall of Justice here knows we have our case made, and somebody's murdered this weekend. How will that play out in the media?" Con Murphy nods. "You're correct." And he says that to Gates and the Block. And Darrell Gates, thank God, said, 11 o'clock, we're all going to go and broadcast on the news the picture of the Night Stalker, and we're going to make it as public as we can. San Francisco is right. We got to go public on this.
Do you think that the detectives who were working those 13, 14 homicides down in their jurisdiction wanted the glory of catching him, and you figured out who he was after one case in San Francisco?
Well, we come to find out there were other cases in San Francisco. And when Mike Mullane and myself were booking him into city prison before he went to San Quentin, we were putting a charge on him for the murder of Peter Pan. He turned around, he looked at me, and he had that symbol on his hand of the circle with the star, the pentagram. And he said, "You know, Falzon," and I didn't know he knew my name. He says, "You'd like to know about those 2 old ladies, wouldn't you?" And it didn't click in my head right away. I looked at him, I said, "2 old ladies?" He said, "Yeah, the 2 up on Telegraph Hill. That was me." And he started laughing. And he walked away with the guards. And bingo, it hit me. It was the Caldwell sisters. That was my murder case 6 months earlier. And we weren't aware that he was hitting in San Francisco, not as much as he was doing in LA, but those 2 cases. And then we found another one, Mike Mullane. Him and his partner had a young girl that was crucified in the Tenderloin and was left hanging from pipes down in the basement after she had been raped and brutalized by this animal. Now I look at that as one of our shining moments in police work, getting that. It was a manhunt all over the state. And the fact that Carl Klotz, Mike Mullane, myself were able to put that together, I'm very proud of that.
As you were putting the pieces together and you were getting closer and closer, what was going through your head? Were you thinking, we might figure out who this guy is, we need to get out there? Was your heart racing? I can imagine a investigation like that, as it starts developing, must have been exciting, thrilling, all of these things.
I can take you back that day when I knew that we were on to something. We raced down to the car. Carl Klotz, I asked Mike Mullane to join me. As we're passing the cafeteria, I ran in, grabbed a powdered donut. I needed a sugar fix. Out to the car. My buddies gave me a bad time because they see me brushing the white powder off my suit jacket. Where's our donut? Where's our donut? Well, I only grabbed one. So that starts the day. So your emotions are going in one direction. Once I heard the name Richard Ramirez, my mind went in a total different direction. Now we had a suspect. And it was like a whirlwind in my mind because everything becomes technical. From that moment forward, you have to do everything picture perfect because there's going to be 12 people on a jury that are going to be looking at your work product and they're going to be deciding if you did things correctly, incorrectly, sloppy, or if you made mistakes. So my mind was a whirlwind about search warrant, arrest warrant, pulling rap sheets, finding out Richard Ramirez, how many was he in San Francisco. We'd find out that there was 6. He had never been arrested in the city. The 6 were mostly out of Los Angeles and Southern California. So we eventually had a picture sent up to us. Armando positively identified his friend Richard Ramirez as Rick Ramirez. Our case is made, and eventually we made all the LA cases also.
Now this is obviously after you've been a homicide inspector for quite some time. I want to go back more than a decade earlier to the early to mid 1970s when things were much different in the city than they are today. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but take me back to the era of the zebra killings.
That was, the zebra killers was all hands on deck.
What was it like in San Francisco in general, not within just your department in the Homicide Bureau, but in general, society kind of coming apart at the seams in some ways?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was like, what can happen next? The city was like a moth to flames. We were drawing in everybody. We had the flower children coming from all over the country with a flower in their hair, singing Kumbaya and smoking weed out in the Haight-Ashbury and drinking wine. And then, there was a big influx of gays from all over the country coming to San Francisco. San Francisco seemed to be the real melting pot of the United States of America. And with it came good and bad. The Vietnam War was such a catalyst to such an uprising of evil. What I witnessed was that Vietnam War veterans coming back that were disillusioned and things that were happening, the shooting and killing of Dr. Foster over in Oakland, and how that spiraled with the SLA and the BLA and the bombings and all these so-called political activists. And these flower children were no longer flower children. They were being turned out onto hard drugs and then made to sell their bodies so that more money could be made. It was definitely a sad time in San Francisco's history.
The spirit of the 1960s was definitively over by the early 1970s, and that anti-establishment sentiment in some ways was being exploited by some of the violent parts of our society.
And the thing that happened that we found out, we're always dealing in the dark as to why people do what they do. We found out that individuals within gangs were targeting each other for control and power. You take the Popeye Jackson case. That was fragments of the tribal thumb and the prisoners' union. Yet, when the case happened and Popeye and an innocent young woman named Sally Boy were killed at 41 Albion Street in the city, right away the left was saying, look at the pigs, look at the police. They're the ones that wanted Popeye dead. And I'm investigating the case and I'm thinking, no, we're trying to catch the killer. And we eventually did. We got a huge break with help from the FBI. We came up with an informant within the gang who would help train some of the members of the Tribal Thumb. And we ended up arresting and convicting a man named Ricardo London.
And then during that same period from 1973 to 1974, you had 15 homicides by one murderous sect who came to be known by the call sign that was used by the SFPD, Zebra. Tell me about being on that task force, and you had alluded to it earlier. Your partner, Jack Cleary, held one of the victims as she died in his arms.
The Zebra Killers was a case that didn't get played up much because it wasn't a narrative that interested the media. It was sad. It was hatred at its best. It was killing white people just for the fact of their color of their skin. The Greeks, we called them the Greeks. It was an affectionate term for Gus Carreras and John Fortinas. They were the lead team on the Zebra investigations. So when Jack and I would catch a case, and when we realized the next morning it was linked to the Zebra killings, that case would be taken from us and given to the Greeks. Eventually, John Fortinas, Gus Carreras needed help, and Jeff Brosh, Carl Klotz were brought over from the burglary detail. And then the two lead black investigators, Rotea Guilford and Earl Sanders, they also were part of the team. They were Gus and John's backup. And then the up and rising robbery inspector named Herman Clark came over and worked with Guilford and Sanders, forming a three-man team. But everyone in the detail was all hands on deck to try and get the Zebra case solved.
And eventually, 7 people were arrested and 4 eventually indicted and convicted, including one of them who you had arrested, correct?
Yes. Later, probably 6-8 months later, Eddie Erlatz and I are working together, and we get a shooting out at the Ocean Beach. And again, it was a random, senseless killing. 2 white girls shot, one murdered, the other one seriously wounded, left dying on the Ocean Beach. And once the killer drove off, the surviving victim, who had been shot in the neck and the mouth, pushed her dead girlfriend off her body, ran across Great Highway, banged on a door, made a phone call to the police. In that case, we eventually also tied to Zebra, but we arrested a fifth suspect. It was tried separately, named Clarence Ferguson. Our thinking was that he was coming to San Francisco during the trial of the 4 accused killers, and he was going to start, he's bringing up a carload of guns to start the murders all over again, so that the defense could argue to the jury that the police did not solve it, that these murders are still active. But we caught him right away and found the cache of weapons. So I think people have to read 5 Henry 7, the book, to really see what was happening in the 70s and the work that these elite detectives that I was associated with, and how proud I was to be part of that team.